So, Madam Chair,
Yes,
do we have a new baby?
I don't know. We're waiting for word.
I bet we don't. If you don't know, we don't.
I don't know if Representative Matos would text me first after he had a baby. Text someone else. Okay, we're going to do some research and we'll report back to the committee later.
Okay.
Okay, so, but I am excited about new babies in the committee.
Me too.
Yes.
And did we get someone volunteering to buy baby clothes or something?
We're going to start the committee meeting and then we can talk about that later. But yes.
Okay.
So, Anor, would you like to join us and talk about school meals? Good morning.
Delighted. Good morning. For the record, I am Anor Horton, and I'm the Executive Director of Hunger Free Vermont. And I'm really excited to be here today. It is School Nutrition Day here in the legislature, so make sure you chat with some of the school nutrition directors who are in the building today.
Just want to celebrate Ways and Means very rarely is able to align our schedule with whatever day is happening in the legislature. And so I just want to give us all credit.
I know. Kudos to all of you for, yes, the timing, brilliant.
Yeah.
All right, very good. I'm the least interesting person of the people in the building to testify on School Nutrition Day today, I think, but you're stuck with me. So anyway, I'm really excited to be here to tell you a little bit about the Universal School Meals Act and what is happening with it and how it intersects with other matters of this committee's concern. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how well the Universal School Meals Act, Act 151, is working right now to end hunger and stigma in our schools by making healthy meals available to every student at every meal, every day, in the most equitable way that we can. And I want to let you know that the design of Act 151, as you all, the legislature, designed it, is unique in the country. And that unique design is allowing Vermont to draw down increased federal funds for some other child nutrition programs in addition to school breakfast and lunch. I want to underscore some of the key points that were made by the Agency of Education in their report and that they're going to expand on quite a bit more about the Universal School Meals Program and how new ways of directly certifying students as low income combined with some coming improvement at the federal level to the community eligibility provision point the way to a sustainable, permanent Universal School Meals Program for all public schools in Vermont. And I also want to learn what's important to all of you and what questions you have so that I can help provide those answers as we work together this session to wrap up this work and make the funding for Vermont's Universal School Meals Program permanent in the Education Fund. And I'm able to be here today to talk to you about the Universal School Meals Program that's operating right now in all public schools in Vermont, because last year this committee played a key role in making the Universal School Meals Program a reality. Those of you who were on Ways and Means last session, along with your other colleagues, and some of you who were in other committees in the building last year, you came out early in setting aside funding off the top of the Education Fund in the Yield Bill. And you showed us that we could move forward with committing to the policy of universal school meals funded from the top of the Education Fund and separately consider the many financial issues associated with the Education Fund. I thank you for that, for kind of forging that path last year and for the discussions you facilitated throughout this building. I'm so happy to be working with this committee once again, this time to permanently fund this highly effective program. So some of us are meeting each other for the first time, and I just want to say a very tiny bit about Hunger Free Vermont, who we are. Hunger Free Vermont is a statewide nonprofit. We're going to be 30 years old in 2023, and our mission is to end the injustice of hunger and malnutrition for everyone in Vermont. So we work in coalitions to advocate for permanent and dignified solutions to hunger at the federal, state, and local levels. And the Universal School Meals Program is a shining example of a permanent and dignified way to end hunger. And we provide education and outreach to the public and to direct service organizations about the federal nutrition programs like Three Squares Vermont and all the different child nutrition programs. So we're eager to be a resource for you and your constituents. Finally, I want to acknowledge Vermont's Agency of Education, particularly Secretary French, Rosie Kruger, and the whole child nutrition program staff. They have done an incredible job of supporting school meal programs through the pandemic and of helping them all get up and running with the Universal School Meals program. That program's working well in large part thanks to them. And they're helping Vermont schools draw down millions more in federal funding for school meals this year. We at Hunger Free Vermont could not be more proud to partner with them to ensure universal school meals are working well and that we develop and implement a strong new system for collecting critical data on family income that we need to draw down federal education funding through the new Universal Income Declaration form that is going to get created this year and implemented next school year, which we're also very excited about.
The new, what did you call it? Universal.
Is that still what it's called, the Universal Income Declaration form, or did it get a different name? And
I think that's what it's still called.
Okay, yeah. And so that form is not in Act 151. It's not in the Universal School Meals Act. It's in Act.
Julia, do you remember the number? What's the act number of
I
the
meant to look it up before I got here.
waiting bill?
The waiting bill.
Is Act 120, Julie Richter, JFO, Act 127.
Act 127, which was passed last year. Yes, but that Universal Income Declaration form works in very powerful ways to make the Universal School Meals program possible without us losing federal education funding. And in fact, to identify all the students possible who are low income to actually help us grow the amount of federal education dollars we can draw down for Vermont schools.
Representative Meslin, did you have something?
I just wondered, I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask. I've heard a little scuttlebutt here and there about the Universal Declaration form, whatever we're gonna call it. You think you're a good repository of scuttlebutt here and there and want to enlighten us on what you've heard, that'd be fine. If it's really a question for somebody else, then that's okay too.
Scuttlebutt on what?
The universal.
I think it's good to get an education, right? Yeah,
Update on that from
Yeah.
everyone who's testifying.
Yeah.
Helpful.
yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
I'll just say from Hunger Free Vermont's role is to support and assist the Agency of Education in developing that form in the way that is easiest for families to fill out, most accessible, and to help make sure that every school in Vermont is very, very clear about how important it is to have every family complete that form. So that is how I see Hunger Free Vermont's role in supporting the Agency of Education in the creation and implementation of the Universal Income Declaration form. Okay, so I'm just gonna, some of you were not here last year when this bill got created, Act 151. And so I'm just gonna say what it does, because it's actually not a very complicated bill, but the precise language in Act 51 is important because it's designed very carefully to ensure that Vermont's Universal School Meals program works with all the federal rules that govern school meal programs and the federal reimbursements for school meals. So Act 151 creates a one-year Universal School Meals program that provides free breakfast and lunch to all public school students. And this is the school year where that one-year program that was created last year is operating. Approved independent schools physically located in Vermont may also participate in the one-year Universal School Meals program for those students who attend on public tuition. Vermont's Education Fund supplements federal per meal reimbursements so that school meal programs receive the full free rate amount that is set by USDA for every breakfast and lunch they serve to students that meet the federal nutrition rules. Schools that participate in the Universal School Meals Program are required to maximize access to federal funds by participating in whichever provision of the National School Lunch and School Breakfast Acts will yield the best federal per meal reimbursement rate. And Act 151 also creates a one-year moratorium on the ability of a school district to ask for an exemption from participation in a school meals program. So what that means is that 100% of public schools in Vermont are providing breakfast and lunch to all students universally under this act. And this is the first time in the history of our state that every single public school has provided breakfast and lunch to all students. And I'll just pause to say that those last two pieces, requiring every school to provide universal breakfast and lunch and requiring every school to use whatever federal provision will maximize their ability to draw down federal reimbursement. Those are the two unique pieces of Act 151 that no other state that has universal meals right now put in their bills. And what that means is that Vermont has been able to really maximize our drawdown of federal funds and make sure that all students really have access in public school to these meals in a way that no other state has done. And our Act 151, is a national model now. So I have sent the text of Act 151 in the last couple weeks to New Mexico, Connecticut, Nevada, North Carolina. So many states all around the country are at work right now to create a universal school meals program like the one in Vermont. And, we're leading the way. The design of Act 151 was really well done last year. So thank you all for everybody who worked on that. So Vermont's Universal School Meals Program is providing other critical benefits. I wouldn't be a good representative of Hunger Free Vermont if I didn't pause for just 1 minute to say what's happening with hunger in our state right now, because the Universal School Meals Act is a critical support for families right now. It's providing a steady source of healthy meals for families and kids that they know they can rely on. And as hunger and food insecurity are at their highest points ever right now in Vermont. So 2 in 5 people, according to University of Vermont researchers, have reported experiencing food insecurity in Vermont sometime in the last 12 months. And all of this is happening. You know that inflation is high. You know that food costs are high. I don't need to tell you that. And you also know that all other federal pandemic, economic, and food support programs are ending, have ended, or are ending, right? The Vermont Everyone Eats, the press release about that just came out in today's Vermont Digger. And all these other programs, including a really significant cut to Three Squares Vermont benefits, which will be hitting after March. So Universal School Meals is providing a critical foundation for families and kids at this time.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Maybe it's too soon in the school year, but is there data and maybe I don't want to preempt your presentation, but do we have data that, already offering, we've seen an increased participation in breakfast or other meal programs? Yes.
So, and the Agency of Education, their report kind of gives the details on that, but it's about a 10% participation increase in both breakfast and lunch so far this school year, which is really, I think, something to really celebrate given, the changes to the program, telling people that, the meals were universally available, but still asking everyone to fill out school meal applications this year. The challenges that, again, the Agency of Education report does a really good job of detailing about challenges with staffing challenges with the cost of food and therefore some issues with food quality that we're seeing with some school meal programs right now. So I think that participation is really likely to continue to increase in school meals over time with the Universal Meals Program. And I think the participation increase we're seeing so far this school year is really something to celebrate.
And just one follow-up about that participation increase. Are we able to tell more about the demographics of those students and where the increase is coming from?
Yes, and I'll leave that to the Agency of Education to say more about that. All right. So I also just want to remind this committee that this Universal School Meals Program was a piece originally of a 3-part package called Farm Fresh School Meals for All. So the package includes universal school meals, the local food purchasing incentive program for schools, and the farm to school and early childhood grant program. And all 3 of these things have been implemented and they're working really well together. So we just talked about increased participation. We've got some evidence that there's increased purchasing of local food by some schools already with the Universal School Meals Program. And so there are just a lot of connected economic and social and environmental benefits for our students, our families, and our communities from Act 151. So again, the Agency of Education is here. They are going to speak to these points more fully, but there are 2 really exciting developments from the federal level that are going to support the financial sustainability of the Universal School Meals Program going forward. One is that the Vermont Agency of Education, our state agencies applied for and were accepted for a pilot to directly certify students, their income for free and reduced price school meals through Medicaid data. And this is really exciting because it means that we're going to actually be able to identify as many, if not more, students eligible for free and reduced price school meals than we were able to do in 2019 when we were doing that through school meal applications primarily. And so that's going to help have the feds cover more of the cost of school meal reimbursements and require the state to not have to cover all those costs. And again, I'm just giving you the broad overview, and then I'm going to get up from here and the Agency of Education can give you all the details. But and then the other is a proposed rule that it will be coming out later this year from USDA that's going to lower the eligibility threshold for schools to use the community eligibility provision. And that's one of the 2 provisions available to schools from USDA to provide universal school meals. But that provision, it tends to give a better reimbursement rate overall for schools when they use that provision. It has less paperwork and administrative burden attached to it. And so this is going to help many more schools in Vermont be able to use the community eligibility provision. It's going to work really well with this matching of data through Medicaid. And again, it's going to just really help the sustainability of the Universal School Meals Program going forward. So Hunger Free Vermont, just again, we really applaud the Agency of Education and their report on universal school meals. And we agree with their assessment that together these 2 factors will likely result in a reduced potential cost for universal meals long term, closer to the lower end of the initial estimate range from JFO last year. And JFO's estimate range last year was 24 million to 40 million. And Hunger Free Vermont's estimate last year was around 24 million as well. So I'm going to close by just saying that the Universal School Meals Program is working great. It fulfills our commitment to equity in our education system. It draws down more federal funding and has a beneficial impact on other child nutrition programs as well. And I want to thank you all for your efforts to wrap up the legislature's work from last session and permanently fund Vermont's Universal School Meals Program in the Education Fund.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please. Thank you for joining us, Julia.
Yes.
I would love at some point in your presentation, and I hope it's in there already, so I'm not putting you in an awkward position, maybe I shouldn't be saying this sentence, but to really, to get clear with the committee about why it matters that we count the number of kids living in poverty.
Sure.
Okay.
Great, thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. And Chair Kornheiser, you set me up well for, I think, one of the later slides in the presentation.
We will get there.
But I do have a presentation. It's just a couple of slides on the committee page under my name, and it's sort of to help the committee have a foundation, so we're all starting from the same conversation point. So pulling up that presentation, I'm on the second slide, background of universal school meals in Vermont. And I know that Nora Horton from Hunger Free Vermont touched on some of this, so I'll remain pretty high level. But when we think about the background and the history, prior to COVID-19, there were some schools in Vermont that were providing universal school meals to students. And the funding of those programs came from federal programs, which were referenced in the previous testimony, the community eligibility provision and provision 2. So that's those federal funds that are being drawn down, as well as local school budgets, which the committee is well aware are funded from the education fund. And then during part of the COVID-19 pandemic, federal funding was available for all schools to provide universal meals at no charge to students and families. And then last year was Act 151 of 2022 was passed, which established that 1 year state-funded universal meal program for FY 2023 and required that all public schools and all public schools in Vermont provide breakfast and lunch to students at no charge, as well as allowing for independent schools to do that for students attending on public tuition. The next slide provides a broad overview of 151. I won't get too much into it because I think the previous testimony covered it well. But really it was that provision of universal school meals for public students. There was an appropriation of $29 million of funding for universal meals. And it required the 2 reports that were referenced. So AOE published a very in-depth report that looked at the impact and status of the Act's implementation, gives a lot more information. And then due on February 1st, the Joint Fiscal Office is due to report possible revenue sources that are not ordinarily used for the general fund for long-term funding of a statewide universal meals program. So that's big picture overview, where we were, where we are now. And now moving into slide 4, and this gets at the chair's question. So we can really think of 3 primary cost factors when thinking of the cost of a universal meals program. And I'm going to walk through each one. So the first is the overall participation rate. So that's how many kids are eating meals every day. And intuitively, we would think, and this is true, that higher participation rate leads to higher costs for the state, right? The more meals that are being served, the higher the cost to cover those meals. The second cost factor is the percent of participating students who are eligible for federal free and reduced price meals. And this gets at the chair's question. So the federal government, and I will defer to Rosie to, of course, speak up. She's really the expert in the room on this, but the federal government has programs, community eligibility provision, or provision and provision 2, which are the 2 primary ways that dollars can be drawn down from the federal government. And the way that works is based on the income level of the students who are drawing down or who are applying for that federal funding. So if they classify within that threshold, then there are federal dollars to either cover the whole cost of the meal or partial cost of the meal. So the higher percentage of students that qualify for that free or reduced price program, the more dollars can be pulled down from the federal government, and the fewer dollars the state needs to make up to cover the cost of those meals. So a higher percentage of ineligible students participating leads to higher costs from the state. So the fewer dollars that get drawn down from the federal government, the more dollars that need to be picked up on the state side of things. And then lastly is the difference between the federal school meal reimbursement rate and the actual per meal costs. So what is the difference there that the state is covering? Does that get at your question?
And then I guess the part that I would add more broadly is that the way that we count kids for the purposes of school meals then has ripple effects across a bunch of other ways we draw down money and how the weights are configured.
Yes, certainly. So there's up until, Act 127, the pupil weighting bill, which passed last year. Before that, the rate of students who are qualifying for free and reduced price lunch was the metric for students coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So that was used as a metric for how many kids are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds in different areas of the states. That's also used in other programs. So this frequently, especially in the education sphere, serves as a metric for what type of background these kids are coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this bothers me. So there's still a chance for stigma for children. Somehow these kids are identified as being low income and part of that group that can help to pull down more federal funds. So somewhere along the way, somebody's got to evaluate each child and what their family income is. If they're poor or middle income or whatever. Is that what this form, the Universal Declaration form, does?
Yeah, so, and I will defer to Rosie, who I think can speak in more detail to this, but the whole concept of pulling down federal funds, at some point in the process, the income level of the families that these students are coming from needs to be determined in order to qualify to pull those dollars down from the federal government.
That's too bad. I thought that now we were doing it without evaluating each family in that way, but we're not. Somebody still is evaluating whether or not these kids are poor, however they're defining that or not, right?
In the beginning of the year. So it's not like a student is going to the lunch line and saying what their family's income is, but the data needs to be collected in the beginning of the year or ahead of time. And then there are nuances to the provisions where, the poverty count will be collected and then that can roll through in multiple years. But I will let Rosie pick up on this or jump in.
Thank you. I appreciate the information.
And let's wait for Rosie to dive into that one.
Okay.
Okay. So that wraps up sort of the three primary cost factors that when we're estimating the cost and thinking about the cost to specifically the state, those are kind of the three primary things that we're looking at: the participation rate, the eligibility rate, and then that difference between the reimbursement rate and the actual costs. And that leads me to slide 5. So projected costs are really on target. There was $29 million that was appropriated last year in Act 151 for the funding of the Universal School Meals Bill. So that was appropriated to the Agency of Education to reimburse schools. Based on the report that AOE just published, if everything stays the same as it was in October, there's a number of caveats there. all the children are eating in equal proportion to their status, participation rates do not increase. The state will pay approximately $27 million for universal meals. That could change as the year continues. Bless you. For the upcoming year, if participation rate of students eating meals changes, that could also impact the cost. So as referenced in the report, there are some issues that are currently suppressing participation. I'll let Rosie speak to that because it is their report. And also moving forward, as I've mentioned, the percentage of students eligible for federal free and reduced dollars, that will also impact the state contribution. So I'm happy to talk about it more. This is really just a big picture where we're at. That my final slide just references the resources that might be helpful to go back through a couple of the helpful reports from Agency of Education, the bill, and the fiscal note that we published on the bill last year.
If every student filled out their form and every student was under the level to receive the free and reduced lunch, would it not cost the state anything, or is there matching that has to be done?
I will defer to Rosie for that question.
Okay.
Thank you, Julia. Really appreciate it. I believe Rosie is the star of this show, but I appreciate that you're us off here.
If you don't mind,
Please.
you, Madam Chair, AOE has self-organized as requested.
Fantastic.
So I just thought I'd give a little update and one clarification up front. So I think what would probably work best is
For the record.
Yes,
I'm so sorry.
Usually so disciplined about that, and I forgot. For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education, and the agency's Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. Wearing my legislative hat, I think it makes the most sense for us to start with Rosie and talk about the school food side of things. Some of the things that Executive Director Horton touched on, she'll go over, and then we'll sort of go in the direction of data and some of the data questions, if that works. One item additional in addition to the report we have, is also the letter that we issued as required about the 5 positions that were created. So I'll make sure, I believe that Sorcia has it already, but I'll check to make sure that we have that for you in case the committee would like to reference. And Director, Assistant Director Keeley will be able to speak to some of the hiring that's been going on related to those positions. The remainder in the budget. And the last thing I'll just note, wearing my communications director hat, there's been some questions about the universal income declaration form, which is, as it's referenced in the bill, you're going to hear us use the term household income form, and Rosie will speak to what that's used for. For the purposes of this, we may end up using that term going forward in the future, but for the purposes of this conversation, household income form and the universal income declaration form, they fulfill the same function. So just wanted to make sure that's clear for folks, at least as what we're using right now, in terms of the federal provisions of universal meals. So
I actually have a question about that, and maybe this is a question for Rosie. I have been imagining that the household income form is the old form that schools were using, and that the universal income form is the new form that you're developing that's more inclusive and easier to fill out. Is that?
That may absolutely be the case, but we're still in the process with that.
Right now you're using them interchangeably.
Correct. And there's a reason for that I'll best leave to Rosie in terms of using the household income form or universal income declaration form versus a free and reduced lunch application. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Welcome, Rosie. I'm really glad you're here.
For the record, Rosie Kruger, I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. So I don't have a formal presentation prepared. I'm going to walk you through a few of the things in the report and answer some of the questions that I heard initially. I think I would really recommend for folks who are new to this conversation to go back and read the report from the task force on universal school meals that we submitted last year, because that kind of goes through how we draw down federal funds to pay for school meals. And the Agency of Education is the state agency that implements the federal child nutrition programs. And these are really federal programs that come with both federal funding and federal requirements. And so we often get lots of questions about, wouldn't it be better if we just did it this way? And the answer is that unfortunately we can't do it that way, because then we'd be risking all of that federal funding that goes along with these programs. So that report really gives you a basis in how the school meals programs work at the federal level and what funding is available for us to draw down, and then how the different ways that we think we can take advantage of those programs and maximize the funding. Some key things for you to just be aware of when we talk about the different categories, the income categories of students to draw down funding. If a student if their household is under 130% of the federal poverty level for their household size, or they participate in another means tested program such as 3 Squares Vermont, which is federally known as SNAP, or Reach Up, which is federally known as TANF, then that student qualifies for what are called free meals, and the federal government reimburses those meals at the full free reimbursement rate, which is a little over $4 this year. If a student's household income is between 185% of the federal poverty level for their size and 130%, then they can submit an income application and qualify for reduced price meals, in which case the federal government funds most of the cost of that meal, except for 40 cents for lunch and 30 cents for breakfast, which normally would be picked up by the household. The household would have to pay that cost. But for many years in Vermont, the state has paid for the student share of the meals for reduced price students. And so meals have been served at no cost to those students for many years, even though they're still referred to as reduced price students. And the state appropriation for that is pretty nominal. I think it costs us less than $500,000 in a normal year to do that. And then if a student doesn't qualify for either free or reduced price meals, either because their household has submitted an application or because they've been directly certified for free meals because of those means tested programs, which means the household doesn't have to submit an application. We just, the state and the school figure out that this child is eligible. If neither of those is true, then the household is considered to be paid. And the federal government does reimburse the state a small amount for those meals, but the remainder is generally expected to be paid for by the household. And that difference is usually around $4 for lunch. And so that's what we're talking about a paid meal or costing the cost of the meal is, that's what we're talking about. It's the difference between the federal paid reimbursement rate and the federal free reimbursement rate. And for the purposes of this discussion, that's what the state is paying this year. And we're calling that the Universal Meals Supplement. That's not language that was in the bill, but we had to call it something. And so that's what we've been calling it. So all of those are set reimbursement rates. Actual school costs to serve meals may be higher, in which case the school would make up that funding from their general fund. But in general, those federal and now state reimbursement rates are meant to cover the cost of providing meals. There are federal requirements that—
Can I ask you a question about that? Schools making sort of individual choices to go above the reimbursed cost. I know, so that would, be part of their education spending and then covered by the Ed Fund and all of us. I'm curious, are there, do you offer guidance beyond sort of the core school nutrition standards that the feds issue?
In terms of like keeping spending down, or
in terms of like how to manage spending or what meals are, appropriate or inappropriate, or just like how does the state participate in those local decisions?
Usually there's a lot of incentive at the local level to keep those costs down because of course it's, school budget and all of that. But we do provide training every year in August for school business managers to kind of give them an overview of the programs The nonprofit school food service account is meant to be an enterprise account. And so the idea is that it's supposed to be balanced. The funds you're bringing in through the federal reimbursements and the paid costs for meals, as well as any a la carte sales or catering or anything like that that schools are doing, that's meant to cover all the costs to provide those meals. It doesn't always work that way, and that's when that general fund contribution comes in. But it's meant to be looked at in a separate account that way.
Thanks. Representative Bodie?
Do you address at all equipment needed to prepare the meals people pay to make and serve the meals?
Yeah, so we, there's a federal equipment grant that's available to schools, and then we actually offer a state equipment grant as well. It's less than $50,000 a year, and that's a matching grant, the state one. So there are some resources available to pay for equipment. And then, of course, they certainly, that federal reimbursement rate and all those funds, those are meant to cover the cost of staff, of food, of equipment, all of those costs of providing a meal. It doesn't always happen, but that's the idea behind that reimbursement rate. So just to kind of give you that context, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about those low-income students and how they qualify to draw down those federal funds. There are two federal universal meals options, Provision 2 and CEP, that have existed for many years, as Honora was mentioning. And as she mentioned, Act 151 requires that in order to receive the state universal meal supplement, the schools participate in those options, which draws that kind of allows us to draw down the most possible federal funds. And several other states that are doing universal meals this year didn't include that. And so their schools are not doing everything possible to draw down those federal funds, and it is costing their states more. So that's definitely been a success that we included that in there. So Julia mentioned that there are two big factors in how much this costs. So there is the number of students who qualify for free and reduced price meals. There's kind of a baseline that's always going to qualify because they're directly certified. And then there's that additional group that qualifies by submitting applications. And this is only a need in the schools that are participating in the Provision 2 option. For the highest poverty schools, they're participating in the community eligibility provision, and their reimbursement rates are based just on direct certification, which is those students who are participating in other means tested programs, times a multiplier of 1.6. So it's pretty easy to kind of do the work in those schools to figure out the percentage of meals that are going to be reimbursed at the free reimbursement rate. But in the Provision 2 schools, those schools that don't qualify to participate in CEP, during the first year of that, we still have to collect applications, and we still have to try and identify every possible student who's eligible. And meals have been free for the last 2.5 years to all students. And so we knew that it was going to be a challenge to get households to return applications this year. We weren't sure how much of a challenge. And so you saw some kind of best case and worst case scenario estimates last year, with the best case being that every household who had previously returned an application and been eligible continued to do that, and there was no change in participation, and we'll talk about participation in a minute. And the worst case scenario for cost being that no household returned applications, and so only the students who are directly certified for meals would get drawing down that free reimbursement rate, and all students choosing to participate. So we're seeing kind of the middle. We are seeing that there was a decrease in households returning applications, but that about 3,000 households did still qualify for free meals, free and reduced price meals by returning an application. So it wasn't the absolute worst case, but we did see an impact. And so that meant that statewide, the percentage of students qualifying for free and reduced meals fell from about 38% in 2019, before the free meals offered during COVID, to about 34% this year. So definitely an impact, but not quite as much of an impact as we could have seen if no households returned applications. We think that there's really good news on that front going forward with the Medicaid pilot that Honora mentioned. So that's going to go into effect starting July of this coming year, July of 2023. And that will allow us to directly certify all of the students who are under 130% of the federal poverty level and participating in Medicaid for free school meals. And we will also be able to directly certify all of the students who are between 185% and 130% for reduced price school meals. And we've never been able to directly certify students for reduced price school meals before. And looking at the initial data from the Department of Vermont Health Access, we think that there's a good possibility that we could basically replace all of the data that we were previously getting from applications with this Medicaid data. The numbers look good. We haven't started doing actual matches yet. So if that's the case, then, we start looking at going back to a statewide free and reduced percentage of around 38% instead of that hit we took this year. So that's great news for costs because it means that we'd be drawing down more of those federal dollars. And
Can you say those percentages again?
Yeah. So pre-COVID, we were at a statewide free and reduced percentage of around 38% of our students qualifying for free and reduced price meals. Now, as of fall of 2022, we're at around 34%.
And then with the Medicaid data.
So with Medicaid, we think, based on just preliminary numbers, and this is all a little squishy at this point because we haven't started doing actual matches, but DEVA is telling us that the number of students who between ages 5 and 18 who fall into those income categories, that range that they think they'll have in September of this year is equivalent to the total number of students who qualified for free and reduced price meals in 2019. So
it's not more.
It could be.
Okay.
But there's a range and we're like in the middle of that range.
Okay.
So we want to wait till we actually do the matches to really be confident about this, but it looks like there's a good possibility that we would be taking no hit in terms of that funding drawdown because we're starting to do the Medicaid pilot. So that's very exciting for the funding side of things. It's also very exciting for the impact on student poverty metrics for all the other non-child nutrition programs. So I mentioned that in the first year of Provision 2, you have to collect these applications. But after the first year of Provision 2, we just claim based on the percentage of children who ate in the first year and what their status was. We just count the total number of meals and we apply that percentage. So after the first year of Provision 2, there is no need to collect any free and reduced meal applications, which means that we're not allowed to collect those applications by the federal government. And there's never any need to collect those applications for schools that are participating in CEP. So again, we're not allowed to collect those applications. And that's why there's this elevated need for a household income form or the universal income declaration to replace that data for all the non-child nutrition programs. It doesn't have any impact on the child nutrition programs themselves, but it goes hand in hand with, if we don't have this data for child nutrition, now we no longer have it for everybody else and we have to do something else.
I'm sort of curious about a list of all the other reasons we need that data, but I can ask Mr. Keeley if
I think
ever is better.
Bob would probably be best to speak to that. There is an extensive section on that in last year's Universal Meals Report as well.
Do you have more you want to share before we?
So there is a bunch in the report about participation. So Lenore mentioned there's a 10% increase in participation so far as of October. We don't yet have numbers for later this year. And so schools have 60 days to submit their information to us. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. It's possible that participation rates will continue to grow this year beyond that increase that we've seen.
Do they usually change throughout the year?
They kind of, they should be kind of steady-ish, but things are very different this year in terms of how the programs are operating. And there's a bunch in the report about why we think participation rates still could increase, that there are a bunch of different factors that could be suppressing participation. And I don't think we've got time today for me to go into that, but if you're curious about that, I would definitely take a look at that. We think that those factors will alleviate over the course of this year and in future years, and in which case we could see another bump in participation at that point, which could have this costing a little bit more for the state. So I don't want you to go ahead and make, huge predictions based on October participation until we start to see later months of this year and then potentially subsequent years as well.
Thank you. I see the hands. We don't have that many minutes left, so I would love to hear from Mr. Keeley for a minute, and then we can put in some questions at the end. Mr. Keeley, can you share a little bit about all the other places we need this data for and federal money? And then also, I'm curious about regional, if you're seeing a difference in regional counts when you look at the anticipated Medicaid data versus people actually filling out those free and reduced meal forms.
Sure, I can talk a little bit more. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you, welcome.
Welcome, Bob Keeley, Agency of Education, Assistant Director for the Data Management Analysis Division, just to cover that again. So we've been actually working with the Federal Education Support Program Division, ANS Division, for the past 2 years on this work. One part is actually building the application for the to apply for the Medicaid demonstration pilot. The other is to understand to what extent does the free and reduced lunch as the use of a proxy for poverty is used across the agency for funding, and it's used a lot in different programs across the agency. So we have that documented in programs across different divisions. The things that come to my head right now without that in front of me is the title funding is heavily reliant on this. So federal dollars that fund schools for title funding require this. So the changing to universal meals was something we recognized we needed to have a handle on managing. So that's sort of an overview of the work we've been doing together over the past 2 years to try and get ahead of what we knew was happening as this changed. I would like a prompt on what other information you'd like at this point, because I'm not entirely sure, given the time left, what's most important to this committee.
I think it's important to the committee to understand how an accurate count of poverty impacts all other aspects of state revenues related to education. And then
right.
The 30s question on data collection, but that could wait for another day. That might just be my pet issue.
Well, that's a really good question, and one I'm not entirely sure we've delved into. I do know poverty has been pretty critical to the pupil weighting, and continues to be, although that's not necessarily a topic I'm well versed in. The division that I support really does a lot of the collection and cleaning and the providing of data for the rest of the agency to use. So we do the work with what we call the local education agencies in order for the agency to have that to report out federally and also to use.
And then the regional differences, maybe we can talk about that another day once you've looked into it. I just know that the collection of the meal forms had a lot of regional, maybe we thought pickup rates might be different from community to community. Last time we talked about this. And so I'd be curious if the Medicaid data winds up different from that. But I know that Ted's hand was hoping to jump in and you can't see that.
For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education. To your question, Madam Chair, about how this is used, I'd like to pass the mic to Director Bordenaro to talk a little bit about titles, but actually this is a good question for Julia. If the committee remembers from the education funding, the title funds are used by school districts when they do their budgeting process. They apply those funds before they calculate their per pupil spending, right? So the amount of title funds that and agencies have passed through mechanism for the majority of this. So the more money that we can send on to schools from the federal government, the less money they have to spend in their budgeting that they put before voters, the more money they have to spend before they set their per pupil spending rate. And if I got anything wrong, Julia, I really apologize. But Director Bordenaro oversees the title programs, and maybe she can talk very briefly about what some of those examples are of what's funded.
Welcome, hello.
Hi, I'm Ann Bordenaro. I'm the director of the Federal Education Support Programs Division. Ted is right. There actually are different ways of calculating poverty that the federal government uses. So our state allocations are not based on our FRL data. Our state allocations are based on census data, SAPI data. So our overall state allocation is not dependent on what percent of families complete the form or don't complete the form, and the bumps up and down year to year in poverty rates. However, really importantly, and actually our allocations to districts are also formula based, and those come directly from the feds. But within districts, whether a school is eligible for title funding in a particular year and how much they will get relative to other schools is based on their FRL numbers currently. So if those numbers drop, long-term, that has implications for total funding for the state. But in the short term, it has implications for schools that might have been eligible to participate in Title I or to operate a school-wide program that serves all students last year and, for example, can't this year. So those numbers are really important. We're working with all of our school districts one-on-one to mitigate any impacts of the declines in the FRL numbers this year that we think are, excuse me, due to a combination of factors, but one of them is the challenge in getting people to complete forms in the era of universal meals. There's also other ways that this data is crucial. It's crucial for a whole bunch of other program eligibilities like after-school funding, career and technical education funding, a lot of this competitive grants that the legislature has approved over the years, including in the last year or two, to support different mental health and social emotional learning and academic recovery and all the rest. Most of those have a component related to need, and we define need in terms of poverty often. The other thing is that individual student eligibilities for programs like the VSAC tuition waiver are based on whether or not they are deemed to be poor. And currently we use the information on FRL in order to make those determinations. And last but not least, and this is crucially important sort of overall to, well, there's the pupil weighting, which we can talk about at a different time. That obviously is directly impacted by FRL numbers and how we gather those numbers and how those numbers go up and down based in part on universal meals programming. But last but not least, we have accountability requirements. We have to report to the federal government every year in exchange for the money that we get. And that part of those accountability requirements ask that we disaggregate student performance data based on a number of factors, whether a student has disabilities, whether a student's in foster care, but importantly, whether a student is low income or not. And so again, we have to know at the student level and at the school level what those poverty rates are. And so this conversation about universal meals has a lot of knock-on effects or impacts on these other factors. And as Bob said in the beginning of his testimony, we've been anticipating this for a long time, as soon as the question of universal meals came up, and we've been preparing for this. And as Rosie started to say, we're very excited that the Medicaid demonstration project, for example, holds great promise to support us in this transition to permanent universal meals, if that's in fact the direction the legislature goes, because it may, if not in whole, at least in part, reduce our reliance on forms, which there is much less of an incentive for families to complete if they're not connected directly to meals eligibility anymore. So that's one of the many things we're doing to mitigate potential knock-on impacts on education programming in anticipation of and in support of universal meals. We can talk about others as well, but I know there's limited time.
Thank you.
Just to your question about the regional impacts, at the end of the report that we submitted, we did break out school by school what their free and reduced percentage was in 2019 compared to this year. And there is wide variation, and we haven't been able to identify what the difference was. You will see it's indicated whether they're a Provision 2 or a CEP school. And so it's the Provision 2 schools that are the ones that had to collect the forms. The CEP schools didn't have to collect the forms. And so really no major impacts there.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a question for you, Rosie, or not, but for the 10% increase, do we know demographic data for that increase?
So we don't yet have accurate data on that because schools are allowed to carry over the free and reduced status from the prior school year. And actually this year we had a waiver to carry it over for multiple years until the 30th operating day, which is usually mid-October. So the data that we have from September and October includes carryover eligibility. So once we see November's data, we'll be able to look at that without that carryover data and really have a sense of who's participating. That initial data did show an increase in an increase in the number of paid students participating and a decrease in some of the other areas for free and reduced students. I would not read that to mean that fewer low-income students are eating, but that instead those low-income households are not returning their applications, and so they're appearing in the paid category instead of the free and reduced category. But we'll have a lot better data on that once we look at November and see what's going on there.
We are at time, but I would, if possible, still love to have a quick update on your progress on the universal income revisions.
Sure, so federal funds for child nutrition programs can't be used for those purposes. Yep. So I'm paying for those funds. Okay. So that's not me, that's other folks at the agency.
Thank you, Rose.
I don't know if Ted's gonna take that one.
For the record, Ted Fisher again. Unfortunately, Assistant Director Keeley has a hard-ish stop. So I just want to introduce him as the primary point of contact for supporting the working group and doing this work. And just note sort of where we are. So there's a requirement in Act 127 in Section 9. So for folks' reference, that's the universal meals, the pupil weighting factors bill done last year that this committee did a lot of work on. Some of the universal meals related provisions are in there. That required a working group to be stood up by October of last year. That work is in progress now, but was not done in the fall due to some operational considerations on the agency's, just in terms of the agency's workflow. Currently, as I noted earlier, we're using the household income form for those provision 2 schools. And that meets our requirements for digital accessibility under federal law. It's also been translated into commonly spoken languages in Vermont. And it's simpler for families to complete than the universal school meals option, the USDA school meals application.
Given our limited time, I just want to cut right to the chase.
Absolutely.
What is your new timeline for the working group and the new form?
I do not believe that there will be any impacts to the requirements in that provision for implementation of the form. The working group is currently in the process of being stood up. So I imagine that we have our internal AOE folks identified. We also have a list of stakeholders from the education field and some of our partners identified in terms of who those will be, and we'll be doing outreach to those people this week. In terms of getting a group together, I imagine we'd be able to provide you an update on how that is going once we get the group together.
So when do you imagine the first meeting would be? Just ballpark.
As soon as possible. We're pretty quick on scheduling, so it's going to be subject to the availability of some of the identified folks. So, for example, people like superintendents to schedule, but I would forecast 2 weeks or so.
Okay.
We're moving.
Great. Thank you. Folks, I see that we have a need to have more conversations about this, and we will schedule further meeting. Please talk to me and Sorsha about sort of we have a lot of witnesses in an hour here, and so let's all have conversations about who needs to come back and how we might want to sort of separate out this conversation going forward. So sorry to cut off the conversation while it was not even getting started.
I would question that may be important and maybe it's not, and you can tell us when you come back. I wonder to what extent everything that you presented in the last hour or so has to do with changes in income because of the pandemic. Up, down, no impact.
I will say that the threshold for qualifying for free and reduced price meals, that is set every year in July, but is based on the Department of Health and Human Services poverty thresholds that are set in January of that year, and those are looking back at the prior year. And so it would be reasonable to look at that time frame for last year and think that probably didn't keep up with the big increases in inflation that we saw over the spring. So we don't have any, hard data showing that, families did or didn't qualify, but it would be reasonable to infer that households that used to qualify might not qualify now, not because they had a huge increase in their salaries, but because of the way that those guidelines have not kept up. And there was in fact a New York Times article this week that kind of looked at some of that and suggested that that might be the case.
Thank you. That was the answer I was looking for.
Okay. We will get back to this, everyone. There's a lot to discover here. Please eat your food and mix.